Hello, everybody. A very warm welcome to you all to Recasting Development in 2024, where over the next hour and a half, we're going to be highlighting some of the really big priorities for development and sharing some ideas on how to make more rapid progress towards a world that's more equitable, more sustainable, more just. This is an event that we ran for the first time in 2023, and due to its popularity, we've decided to run it again. We have, of course, hit in the UK a day of a train strike, which may have diminished some of the people in the room, but we still have an excellent in-person audience, as well as several hundred who've joined us online from all over the world. So over the next time, we're going to be looking at 5 key themes that have emerged from our work with partners as being significant to where development is heading next. Most broadly, 2023, of course, was an important year in many respects. Positively, perhaps, it marked the midpoint towards the Sustainable Development Goals, which everybody knows are way off track, but nevertheless do represent the best thing we have as a roadmap towards the future. So a big need to recommit, not just to the particular goals, but to the synergies between them. Rather more worryingly, 2023 was also the hottest year on record. And as the planet heats, the need for adaptation increases, as does the need to transition or transform to more green economies and societies as quickly, but also as equitably as possible. The climate change COP in November saw finally an agreement to move away from fossil fuels, but this now needs to be followed up with really decisive action. My colleague John Gaventa is going to be talking about the power interests that need to be tackled to ensure that transitions both happen and are just. 2023, of course, also saw an increase in humanitarian crises around the world. And as Philip Proudfoot will be highlighting, this has made the viability of the humanitarian system seriously under threat. Last year saw the highest number of declared emergencies in the last 10 years, with food shortages in particular becoming more and more common. The crisis in Gaza, with millions held under siege, now, of course, threatens to spiral into broader regional conflict, and it's going to be civilians who are and will be bearing the brunt. So what of 2024? A key headline is that it's going to be a huge year for elections and broader questions around democracy, as our first presentation from Marioka Oosterom is going to explore. Whilst improving political participation and restoring trust and viability in our political systems is key, we've also identified many challenges around economic democracy. And Jodie Thorpe is going to be highlighting the exclusion of citizens from the economic decisions that affect their lives, focusing particularly on the breakdown in food democracy and systems. Meanwhile, the ability of so many nations to invest in development is being deeply hampered by finances. Multiple crises, including the COVID pandemic, have left so many countries with really crippling debts. And Mbakiso Magwebape is going to be investigating this issue for us, highlighting some of the prospects for the international financial system to deliver and to be made more equitable over the next year. So given the scale of all these challenges and what many of us tend to term these days as multiple intersecting crises, what more broadly can those in the development and development studies community really be doing to make a difference? We've called this event Recasting Development, which captures some broader reflections that many of us at IDS and with our partners are engaged in, arguing for some changes in approach in how development and mobilization for change are supported. And key emphases here include challenging the knowledge and power hierarchies that have so long pervaded international development as part of efforts to work in genuinely more equitable ways and engage with those vital debates, multi-stranded debates on decolonization. It includes going well beyond the discourses and practices of the aid industry. Development is much more than that and involves many, many different actors. And crucially, it involves going beyond simple divisions between the global north and the global south to recognize that some challenges are common to people across the world, even if experienced in very different ways. So in all countries, for instance, climate change is affecting marginalized communities more than privileged communities. And democracy, as we'll see, is under threat not just in lower middle income countries, but in the wealthiest parts of the world too. So what we're calling for at IDS is a more transformative, egalitarian and inclusive knowledge and politics in development, relevant to all settings across the world. Not one which is European or US-centric, but one which includes more global South-led voices, but that challenges the structural inequalities in the power relations, not just between different parts of the world, but within them too. So I think in different ways, our 5 excellent speakers will be picking up on some of these bigger themes, and I hope we can also come back to them in discussion. But now, without any further delay, let me hand over to our speakers. And I'd first like to welcome Marioka Oosterom, who leads our Power and Popular Politics cluster, to talk to us about what may be ahead in political participation.
Thank you, Melissa. So 2024 will be possibly the biggest election year in history, with more than 70 elections in over 50 countries. So around 2 billion people can go to the polls, but whether these are free and fair elections, that's the big questions. Some observers have said that this is going to be the test for democracy and even the most robust democracies itself. And actual election violence is anticipated in several countries. Let's just have a very quick look at some of them. Bangladesh went to the polls earlier this month. The incumbent and incumbent leader won again, having nearly decimated the political opposition. Mozambique has a track record of political violence, oppression of opposition and civil society. Last year's local elections triggered mass protests, and we're expecting that again later this year. Many eyes will be on the US elections and what the potential re-election of Donald Trump will do for democracy, also globally. Political violence has been on the rise, mostly coming from the right, and research shows that many Americans are now supporting or willing to commit or excusing political violence against others. So elections were once the cornerstone of democracy, but we've entered a new era where they might create a facade of democracy. And the real cornerstone will be whether those elected will actually respect human rights and political freedoms. My research over the last 10 years has focused on youth participation in context of violence and repression. And a quarter of the world population is now between the ages of 15 and 35. So that includes a lot of young voters. And their votes matter because in Brazil's last election, it was the youth vote that beat Bolsonaro. But democracy hasn't worked for many young people. The average age of MPs globally is 52, so that's not a fair reflection of the youth population. Many young people do not vote because of corruption among politicians, because they think it doesn't bring any change. And in fact, they point out most of those things that we now associate with democratic deficits. So it's not surprising that last year, the Open Society Barometer revealed that young people are now least likely to have faith in democracy. Only 57% of those in the age group 18 to 35 think that democracy is preferable to any other form of government. But there's a risk here that now young people get blamed for walking away from democracy, while it's actually the political elites causing the decline. And expectations of what young people should be doing for democracy are incredibly high, while international development has consistently prioritized youth employment over youth democratic citizenship. And while especially now, those local level spaces where young people can learn civic and political action and collective action are so important because they build democratic stock. Authoritarian leaders are happily jumping into the void, and they are very aware of their large youth populations. And recent research in African countries done by me and colleagues at CMI and in various African contexts has demonstrated how youth-targeted strategies are now very firmly on the menu of manipulation by autocratic regimes. So what can we expect in the year ahead? Support for democracy is still very high in many places. And globally, people affected by authoritarianism are resisting their rights being removed, and they're protesting unfair elections, as we can see here there is a real desire and call for representation, inclusion, and accountability. So some of these examples: street protests, graffiti, memes that go around online, arts, music, even in some of the most repressive environments. So looking ahead and connecting this to youth politics, it's established already that many young people prefer these kinds of informal forms of political action over formal political participation, like voting. They are part of this democratic stock, and it matters because last year the VDEM Institute analyzed 8 democracies that were on a trajectory of backsliding, and they bounced back to democratization. And why was this? Yes, because of elections, and yes, because there was a stronger judiciary, but also because of mass protest, when these kinds of actions becoming incredibly important, a unified opposition coalescing with civil society, and international support and protection. So these multiple accountability actors, they work together, and the so-called democratic stock helps them do and play that role. In the coming year, therefore, what we need to look out for is not just the election results, but also all of these kinds of political actions, formal and informal, that also express the voice of people, and especially younger generations. And what this means for international development. Well, I'm really concerned that also funding for democracy is backsliding. And I'm glad that the petition by large civil society organizations globally went out to the United Nations last November, calling for a UN Special Rapporteur on democracy. This year's European elections may be really critical for the EU's commitment to democracy, not just here in Europe, but also beyond. The election results will likely reflect the increase in right-wing populist politics of its individual member states, and previous research on aid spending and commitment to democracy has shown that more populist politics in parliament, and especially in cabinet, has real negative impact on commitment to aid funding. So we'll find out if the European donors will step to their values, and I hope they do in the coming years. To conclude, let's hope that the 2024 elections will restore democracy in many places. And for us as researchers, it will be an opportunity to investigate where elections do so and why there, but also how exactly have they interacted with all these informal forms of participation, and especially among the largest group in their countries, which is the youth population. And what kind of informal participation and resistance to authoritarianism is exactly helping to counter what kind of backlash? Thank you.
Thank you, Marioka. So now going to hand over to Jodie Thorpe, who's in our business markets in the city cluster, to talk to us about economic democracy and food.
As Melissa said, I'm going to continue the theme of democracy, but think about it from an economic perspective. And there's a long academic tradition in thinking about the relationship between economic development and democracy and democratization. But now we're facing a different set of challenges and a different set of questions as extreme levels of economic inequality and increasing market concentration are changing the dynamics, with fewer and fewer global companies holding more and more power and bringing a different set of implications. Whoops, forward. So here we're seeing concerns, for example, about the relationship between economic inequality and trust in democracy. A resistance against investments, including investments that are being backed by governments in areas such as mining or oil and gas, and concerns by those who are affected by new technological innovations in green technologies or AI. And many democracies are trying to respond to these pressures with a fairly familiar set of policies, either on the one hand, looking at new forms of welfare to try and redistribute the benefits of economic gains, or efforts to promote more economic activity on the premise that positive externalities will trickle down to the population. But neither of those sets of responses is really matching demands that are coming for alternative development models that rethink how the economy works and to what ends. We do find experimentation with alternative forms of economic activity in different sectors and different actors leading these alternatives, in which people are seeking greater control over the economy in areas that affect their lives. In other words, a democratization of the economy. To be clear, there have been past experiences and experimentations with what could be called economic democratization, for example, involving workers on the boards of companies, a form of industrial democracy, or collective ownership through cooperatives, participatory budgeting, bringing people into government social spending decisions. But here I mean something slightly different, or at least additional to those examples, a deepening of democratic practice through new forms and new processes of participation and deliberation, in which decisions about what to produce and exchange and how, through what technologies and networks, involve people that are affected by those decisions. And especially with the aim of thinking about balancing different goals and different objectives of the economy. I'm going to, just to illustrate what I mean, I'm going to speak to some examples from food. So food is the area where I work, and food is an area where we've seen significant protests sometimes against genetic modification, for example, or against supermarkets moving into neighborhoods and pushing out local shops. In other words, against the industrialization of the food system. But the examples I want to use to think about how people are pushing for more participative and deliberative decision-making that better balances goals, yes, of food provision, but also of the environment, health and well-being, culture. And I'm borrowing these examples from a recent collaboration between IDS and SEBRAP in Brazil and the University of Toronto in Canada, where the main aim there was to study social innovations in response to COVID. But I think these examples are interesting for what they've been doing before and during COVID. In the interest of time, I'm going to focus on the first two, but I'm happy to pick up the last example from here in Brighton in the discussion. So just to take the first two, Agência Solano Trinidade, this is a community space to strengthen the creative economy in one of Sao Paulo's favelas in Brazil. It offers Black artists a place to work, to access funding, and to connect knowledge, but also food is part of the creative economy. And they have an organic restaurant that promotes healthy eating within the community and buys from local small businesses. During the pandemic, they delivered 30,000 organic food baskets to marginalized local populations, often including books by Black authors. And I see their experiences as participative or participative democracy because it is a self-organizing cultural movement. And I see it as economic because they're affecting what food is available to the population and where it comes from. They also have an interesting, by the way, link to more traditional forms of representative democracy as they help create something called Quilombo Periférico, which is an elected cooperative mandate of 6 leaders that are representing the Black population of peri-urban areas of Sao Paulo on the city government. The second example, the African Food Basket, champions food justice amongst African Canadian communities in Toronto. They have traditionally been involved in activities like seed saving, urban agriculture, new product development, and skills development, as well as delivering baskets of healthy, but importantly, culturally appropriate food during the pandemic. They also have a link to more deliberate, I mean, they're also self-organizing and participative in that sense, but they've also promoted deliberative democracy through initiating dialogue about food sovereignty for Black communities in Toronto. This dialogue involved researchers, policymakers, activists, and organizations critically reflecting on the food system and led to Canada's first Black food sovereignty plan in 2021. So to conclude, I've used food as an example to illustrate routes towards economic democratization, but there are examples from other areas of the economy, from mining and green energy to the knowledge economy. Such cases have sometimes been studied from a perspective of social justice, but I think there is an urgent and important need to look at these from a political science lens to respond to the demand for alternatives in ways that promote more balanced outcomes from the economy. So questions about comparing efforts to democratize the economy in more participative and deliberative ways. How do they work? How do they relate to each other? The sort of competencies, resources, and arrangements that enable economic democratization. The conditions that enable local efforts to be institutionalized or engaged with by authorities, public and private, or opposed, and with what implications. And importantly as well, whether these initiatives are inevitably niche and local or can be connected across different scales to wider systemic transformation. And I think if we can understand these questions better, it's an opportunity to recast economic development in a more collaborative and inclusive manner.
Thank you, Jodie. So now moving on to Philip and to the extremely important hot theme of humanitarianism.
So, yeah, I'm going to be trying to answer this question. Do we need to accept that humanitarianism is political? And not to spoil it, but the answer is yes. So for those who don't know the story of humanitarianism, it began in the 19th century. This is the Orthodox Western story. It began in the 19th century with a Swiss man leaving Geneva, heading to Italy, where he came across the Battle of Solferino. He was so appalled by what he saw. He worked with local townsmen to assist the injured, wrote a memoir about it, and then that led to the foundation of the Red Cross. And the Red Cross's initial mission, as was founded by this guy who's called Henry Dunant, I should have said his name. Their initial mission was to look after and treat injured soldiers regardless of their side. And at that point, we begin to see humanitarians' relationship with politics emerge. It takes as its objective intervention the individual suffering human being, stripped of all political considerations. That is the objective intervention. And that is the point at which a kind of apolitical orientation has emerged and been consistent throughout the development trajectory of humanitarianism. And we see it in international law, we see it in organizational constitutions, promotional material. This is something one can trace across that 160 years since Solferino. And Solferino then, in the humanitarian imagination, is essentially the Westphalia for humanitarians. This is the origin and the foundation point. But of course, the understanding of politics contained within the idea of impartially assisting people regardless of any other consideration, and the values that emerged, humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence, takes quite a narrow definition of politics, meaning the work of states, governments, cabinets, ministries. Doesn't mean a more philosophical understanding of politics as the collective means by which humans decide how to distribute power and resources. Because, of course, all humanitarian operations determine how to distribute resources. At a macro level, they interact with donors who have stipulations. Those stipulations are then fed through coordination mechanisms, which eventually might result in some sort of activity at the end. There's a lot of political decision-making. At the micro level, humanitarians, when they assess needs, discover vulnerabilities, and decide what to do about them, are also making political decisions. Increasingly, as we'll see in protracted crises, this includes integrating refugees into labour markets or providing SME-type activity. The underlying political assumption is that it's better to work for a living, it's better to sell your labour for a wage than to rely on handouts. Now, refugees might say back, well, we want to, and it's dignified. But that itself, that idea of dignity, is also a political conception. So I think that the traditional justification for humanitarians distancing themselves formally from politics, if it was ever real, is beginning to move into a state of crisis. It's always been in crisis, but it's particularly intense now. So I'm not saying anything that new. But what we have is two forces that are throwing it into question. We have long-term proliferating protracted crises, and then short-term, we have the genocide in Gaza. And in both cases, the traditional justification that political neutrality allows for access, what access in Gaza, and it's ethical, what ethics in the face of a genocide, have fallen into disrepute. So on to protracted crisis. Humanitarians across the world are increasingly finding themselves acting as a kind of shadow government. They're acting as a shadow government without a political ideology on which to base how they build the state. This is throwing them into persistent problems when they are pushed up against development actors. Development actors often have normative agendas, ideas of the state. The World Bank has a vision of the state. The IMF has a vision of the state. The ILO has a vision of the state. What is the humanitarian vision of the state? What are they seeking to build? It's absent because humanitarianism is largely, and this is why I always explain to students when they ask the difference, humanitarians move things in the present. Development builds things for the future. The moment you start building things for the future, you're envisioning a kind of state. But how can you do that without a core political set of values? And finally, in the short term, the situation in Gaza is so extreme that humanitarianism's attempt to distance itself from politics is unraveling before our eyes and throwing into such sharp relief the failures of the global order to respond to a genocide for which it was set up to respond to. I tried my best to try and list from a sort of humanitarian perspective the areas of law, operations, and morality that are currently being violated. And I had to stop myself when I got to that point. And I don't really have time to go through all of them, but it ranges from deliberate destruction of OIS, objects essential for survival, objects indispensable for survival, to direct targeting of UN and civilian infrastructure, PNGing humanitarians, preventing needs assessments, deconfliction is impossible. Humanitarians pass their coordinates, nothing is done about it. They send their coordinates to the Americans, asking them to ensure that the Israelis do not attack humanitarian infrastructure. It is extreme. You only need to listen to the words of the global humanitarian leadership to understand how serious it is. And the moral authority on which so much humanitarian goodwill rests has also collapsed. We have political leaders abusing the word humanitarian pause, consistently making reference to humanitarian aid and ignoring the fact that the Interagency Standing Committee, Martin Griffiths, and the leaders of the aid world have called for one thing, and that is a ceasefire. Donor political alignments are unavoidable and clear to all. I initially had campaign against UNRWA. I've had to update that now to removing the funding from UNRWA. And in Palestine, UNRWA is a substitute state in the same way that I was just talking about. So to defund UNRWA is to place sanctions to Palestinians for their own genocide. This is the level of severity that we are facing. So this has a consequence when we take all of this. This is how the values now look to much of the world. Humanity is racialized. The situation in Gaza hit at the same time that we saw the Western response to Ukraine. That is what's produced this clear sense that humanity does not count for people in Palestine. Neutrality looks like complicity. Impartiality looks biased. And independence looks controlled. You only have to look at the signs of responses, reports, and sentiments that are emerging in response to this vast violation, and it will have lasting consequences for the humanitarian world. Which then led me to think, what would our research agenda be at IDS? So what I'm interested in is thinking about what would actually happen to the humanitarian system faced with all of that, the challenge of building a humanitarian state and crises that never seem to go away, the challenge of vast levels of impunity. If we just try and get rid of this word, which I think is the biggest problem, and we replace it with this word. Thank you.
Philip, thank you so much. Let's now move on to think about finances and the kind of context in which, again, so much of this is playing out. So Mbakiso Magwape, who's part of our governance cluster and also our International Centre for Tax and Development. So Mbakiso.
Thank you very much. I think I'm just blown away by the linkages that different speakers have been speaking about and how various areas are interconnected to each other. Particularly when we talk about finance and financial systems, you can't talk about financial systems without addressing climate transformation or food shortages as a result of global warming. When you talk about financial systems, we're talking about how do countries finance critical aspects of development, right? But one of the most interesting conversations, funny conversation I've had this week about recasting development was about how cryptic the title was. You know, very abstract. Two people actually asked me, what does it even mean? But I like the phrasing of recasting development because it enables us to take stock of where we are, institutional arrangements which have already affected a number of countries so that we can determine intervention measures that we can have. And when you talk about financial systems, the question is, who set the systems in place? How effective have they been in facilitating development for which states? And who has a voice, especially with the debt crisis, where countries are saying we need money, and are they getting it? And what are the implications when they don't get it? But I'd just like to start with the general statement, or this is a research finding actually in the 2023 Financing for Sustainable Development report. This is a UN report. And it states 52 low and middle income developing countries are either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, accounting for more than 40% of people vulnerable to poverty. The currency you see in the background is the kwacha. That's the Zambian kwacha. Zambia was the first country to default during the COVID-19 pandemic, right? And it wasn't the only country to default. And this is on sovereign debt, on its bonds. And it owed a number of creditors, which included private and also MDBs, multilateral development banks, talking about IMF, World Bank. It also owed private entities like BlackRock, which just got into a deal with purchase an infrastructure company, by the way, and which Gatwick Airport runs. So I'm just trying to show you the financial strength of some of these creditors. What does it mean? What it means is there's now pressure over and above hyperinflation and depreciating currencies, which it's had. There's now pressure on the government in terms of how much they can spend on development. What does that mean? 2021, 2022, they had a budget deficit around 8%, only went down last year to about 5%. What that simply means is that if the government has a budget to pay for children to eat at school or to build road developments, it might not be able to do that in certain regions, right? And I'll address that a little bit further on as we go on. But the first question is, how did we get here? First, as developing countries, I keep saying as developing countries because I'm from Botswana. We are a middle-income country, but there are a lot of aspects which I will also address regarding positions of countries and the ability to lend if I have enough time. But we have to take stock of overlending. We can't say this international system is messed up. Corruption, public financial management deficiencies. In fact, on this particular point, last year, there was an interesting case in Zimbabwe regarding the Zimbabwean Coalition for Debt and Development, where they took the government to court over a loan which the government wanted to enter into, out of account of parliamentary deficiencies, the fact that they hadn't gazetted, they hadn't disclosed how much they were going to borrow. So it's not just about the management, but it's just the process of how countries dig themselves in deeper debt when it's unsustainable debt. Secondly, the international financial architecture, high costs. There's been a lot which has been discussed about how countries can borrow credit. Zambia, by the way, which we're talking about, they took 3 years to reach a deal on restructuring 6.3 billion of their finance. And even when they did reach a deal, some of their private creditors opposed the deal because they believed they were getting more of a haircut on interest payments and the conditions weren't suiting them compared to other creditors. And this was taking place under the G20 framework and common framework. And that's one of the institutions which has a bit of hope in terms of trying to address restructuring debt. Inadequate taxation. if you talk about sustainable development, you cannot address it without addressing the issue of taxation. Why? Because what you spend on, you should be able to make. If you ever want to know how governments make money, it's through taxation. One of the primary revenue mobilization factors is taxation. And where does Africa stand? Africa, not just Africa, this is developing countries in general. Sorry, apologies. This statistic was focused on sub-Saharan Africa. That's sub-Saharan Africa collects 17% of GDP in taxation, as opposed to 34% in advanced economies, which means they're collecting way less. And during COVID-19, and I'm just going to connect it with this point, we saw something very interesting where revenue dropped, especially in critical types of taxation like VAT, absolutely dropped. But what happened? Expenditure went up because countries had to pay for PPE and critical healthcare services. So imagine your costs are going up, but your revenue is going down. What will that trigger? Debt crisis. So another question is, how suitable are our financial systems in being resistant to issues regarding crisis? Now, risks and opportunities. Infrastructure. If you have challenges with servicing debt, that means that your infrastructural development slows down, which has a knock-on effect on multiple issues. Let's talk about, since we're talking about Zambia and energy, Zambia currently has got an energy crisis. It also simultaneously has a food shortage crisis. And one of the reasons why they have an energy crisis, and they use hydropower. I was in Lusaka a few years ago, and some of my friends were telling me that their electricity is one of the cheapest in the region. Fact, because it's hydropower from rivers dammed. Now, because of the global climate crisis, in terms of global warming, rivers which were perennial and kept flowing have now slowed down, which means you don't have energy for one of the first few times ever, which also simultaneously in terms of, because of the heat, affects crops. So now you've got problems after problems after problems. So that's where you talk about climate adaptability. All of this requires finance, right? African Continental Free Trade Agreement. The Continental Free Trade Agreement requires public infrastructure. In order for Africa to develop, we need public infrastructure in critical sectors in order for trade to build up and for the country to close trade deficits and for countries to develop. Why I say it needs infrastructure is interesting fact. I really wish I could show this graph, but there's not enough time. Our roads were developed to have primary goods exported, right, without development. So our roads, our ports, our railway system face out. There's an interesting graph where you show them out, as opposed to Europe, where they're all interconnected because of regional trade. And the Continental Free Trade Agreement, the whole objective of it is Africans trade with other Africans in order to reduce dependency on imports, but that needs roads and connectivity. This particular picture here, this is the Mohembo Bridge. This is in Botswana, northern Botswana. This is a pontoon ferry. It took sometimes days for them to cross when the river was full. And when they transport goods, they'd collect, sometimes based on the river, it would capsize. So Africa needs bridges like this one. Fortunate enough, it was completed last year. It needs bridges, but that needs finance and investment. So it's a risk and an opportunity, because if you don't get your financing, your major projects collapse. Priority issues, food security, climate adaptation. My time is running out, so I can't speak too much, but we've already addressed climate adaptation. Priority areas for reform. The domestic and international tax regimes need work. Domestically, what we mean is ICTD does a lot of work on this. And you need to improve revenue administration collection, and that might be through multiple means. Sometimes also, that also might mean going after high net wealth individuals. There's a misconception that developing countries or everyone in developing countries struggles. There are significant amount of groupings of people who can be taxed and spend money in London on expensive properties. right? We need to collect for ourselves. But international tax regime, we also need to be able to address what they refer to as source residence taxing rights. Withholding tax, this is where the instances where, let's say a mining company, African companies or developing countries are not able to sufficiently tax based on tax rules. They say do not tax more than, let's say, 10% of a multinational's investment. So those are rules which need to change. International financial architecture, G20 common framework, countries need to be able to have access to credit, especially for high priority areas. Accountability, we need to be more accountable. We need to take stock of expenditure, public financial management, and part of expenditure is also being able to look at how much tax incentives we're giving to some multinationals. There's interesting research on this area, but it's actually found that giving these large multinationals incentives does not necessarily result in the location decisions of them coming to your country. So basically, you're giving incentives for nothing. So we need to take stock and reconfigure our systems. Lastly, multilateral bodies can all feed into prioritizing and mainstreaming developmental aspects of finance. Most financial conversations are had in international law forums, economic and financial forums with people focused on creditor rights, focused on who gets the least haircut. It's all orientated on the private sector, but we need to mainstream this into the development sector because it all feeds into the developmental aspects because the developing countries are the ones who need the finance the most. Tough rushing, but I hope some points got across. Thank you very much.
So finally, but by no means least in our 5 themes, I'll turn to John Gaventa to share some thoughts about just transitions in the context of climate and environmental challenges. So John, over to you.
Thanks, Melissa. Good evening, all. Development and power are deeply intertwined. As our esteemed emeritus colleague Robert Chambers once wrote, considering development without power and relationships is like considering irrigation without considering water. Indeed, IDS has a long history of taking a grounded critical view of power relations as they affect a multitude of issues, whether these be gender, governance, participation, poverty, inequality, or more. Today in 2024, in the face of climate change, a critical new issue is how we transition from a development model based on extraction and use of fossil fuels to a post-fossil fuel world. And how do we do so in a fair and inclusive way? In the last few years, the term just transition has become one of the latest trending phrases in development, which has a lot of trending phrases. But having just received one mention in the 2015 Paris Agreement, by COP28, just 8 years later, the phrase was everywhere. But the concept of justice within the phrase just transition is also inevitably tied to questions of power. Literature on justice, on just transition, usually mentions at least 4 kinds of justice. Distributional justice is about who pays and who benefits in this transition. Procedural justice is about who participates in the decisions which guide it. Recognitional justice is about whose knowledges and culture are valued. And restorative or reparatory justice are about how to correct the previous abuses brought on by decades of control by the fossil fuel industry. But each of these, who wins, who participates, whose knowledge, whose history, are themselves questions of power. By this we mean, of course, not simply the technical process of how to transition from one form of energy power, from wind to oil or oil to wind, but more fundamentally, how we challenge and transform the forms of social, economic, political, and ideological power upon which the fossil fuel industry is built and to which it has deeply contributed. To face this challenge, a number of researchers at IDS and previously the STEP Center and at the University of Sussex have been taking a power-informed view to understand the possibilities and pathways to a just transition. In my own work, for instance, I've been revisiting research I did some 50 years ago as a PhD student, which was later published as this book, Power and Powerlessness in an Appalachian Valley. Drawing on the theoretical frame of power developed by Stephen Lukes, that book traced the development of power relations in a remote coal mining valley in the rural United States, as the land was taken over and power concentrated in the hands of an absentee British company. But today, these coal mines are gone. And while as social scientists, we know a great deal about how power relations are established and how they are maintained, we know less on what happens when the material base on which power rests declines, in this case, coal extraction. How do old forms of power recede? And when they do, what new forms of power come in their place? To answer this question, a colleague and I have returned to this Appalachian Valley, the same one, to examine how power changes in the process of transition. The results are fascinating, and I can't do justice to them in the time here. None of the speakers can cover all their points, these important points, but allow me to share a few highlights from this one little microcosm of change. In a historically vulnerable area, the closure of the mining industry has left in its wake even greater inequality, poverty, joblessness, and environmental destruction than was there before. Any approach to transition, therefore, in such communities has to start with a recognition of the legacy of historical injustice in order to achieve any sense of future justice. History has to speak to the future. The process of disinvestment in the mining industry has also left behind hollowed out communities, and those hollowed out communities become fertile ground for other corporate predators, including in this case, pharmaceutical companies, which have pressed upon the residents' opioid and drug dependency as solutions to their pain, but as another way to extract corporate profit, this time from their bodies instead of from their land. Playing upon the anger and insecurity of these abandoned communities now face, such places also become fertile ground for the rise of authoritarianism. In this valley, for instance, as the mines have closed, we've seen a transformation from largely Democratic voting to now 90% for Trump and his brand of right-wing conservatism, a pattern found in abandoned communities across America. If you look at the statistics, those zip codes that have had the most outpopulation and the most loss of jobs have the highest support for Trump. Into this vacuum, we also see the rise of new actors seeking to move from a model of corporate extraction of natural resources to one of the financialization of these nature's resources. In this case, the example is through the takeover of the land by NatureVest, a profit-making investment arm of the NGO, the Nature Conservancy, one of the world's largest environmental NGOs, with huge plans for carbon credits and other schemes to benefit its investors, but with little benefits for the local communities. So with these changes in the material reality also come big changes in power dynamics. Old power holders, the elites associated with the coal industry, don't just go away when their industry closes. They struggle to cling on to power in their position in multiple ways. New investors, like the Nature Conservancy, bring forms of power less based on local control of labor and community, as these are no longer needed for coal extraction. Their power is more based on hidden investments in distant global financial markets and in touting new ideologies of the benefits of nature-based development for profit. At the same time, the decline of old forms of power allows spaces for new forms of mobilization from below, as communities struggle now both to reclaim their past, but also to demand a new future. With this comes a shift from oppositional grassroots politics that demand accountability from power holders to propositional politics, which requires envisioning a new future. And that's a difficult shift to make. Moreover, just as legacies of domination don't fade away quickly when the material base changes, neither do legacies of internalized powerlessness, which have arisen from 100 years of that domination. So by tracing these processes in one place over the last 50 years, we hope to get a more grounded insight of what just transition might really look like in practice. Watch this space for the new book. But in conclusion, I want to argue that what this small valley in rural America is experiencing is not unique. In fact, it reflects a microcosm of the changing power dynamics in the process of transition writ large. A development model based on natural resource extraction and the systems of colonial power which has supported it for centuries affects thousands of such small places around the world, be they in Asia, Africa, Latin America. New places are also being affected as corporations scramble for alternative minerals to fuel new forms of energy, yet they often are simply replicating the extractive model of the past. Even more broadly, the dominant model of growth and development itself depends on the availability of these sources of power to fuel an economic system based on global supply chains, mass consumption, cheap forms of energy, transport, food, and agriculture, all of which are subsidized by the abuse of planetary boundaries. In the midst of such changes, just as in the valley, we see fossil fuel corporations and elites struggling to hang on, oil companies investing more and more in PR and greenwashing to protect their own power, and often linked to rising forms of authoritarianism. But we also see new forms of contestation emerging as social movements demand climate justice, as communities and workers seek new forms of energy production, as development theorists seek alternatives to growth approaches. It's an exciting time, but the question remains, whose justice will predominate in this transition? Who will be the winners and losers? Whose voices will be heard? Whose knowledge will be counted? And whose histories and futures will prevail? Recasting development in the 21st century means addressing these age-old questions. It means envisioning and struggling towards a just transition that recasts not only our dependency on fossil fuels, but which reshapes power relations as well.
Well, thank you, John. Thank you to all 5 of our speakers. I'm absolutely struck by the interconnections between what everybody has said, but that's not for now. I'm sure you've all in the room and online picked up some of those for yourselves. So I'm going to move straight away now to open up for questions and comments. Please try to keep them quite short and to the point so that we can get through plenty. And I'm going to start maybe by taking about 3 from the room and then a couple from our online audience. And then I'll come back to the panel to pick up the relevant ones. And then we'll open up for a second round. So would anybody like to begin? Yeah, okay, so we'll come to the front row here.
Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Ojo Emmanuel Eniton. I'm a representative of Commonwealth Youth Organization of Nigeria. The fact that the program that we are having tonight, what prompts me to be here today is the previous event that we had last year. So I decided to be here in person from Nigeria. So it's part of the achievement for this research institute. So my question is this: how can recast development relate to civil society in Africa at large? Thank you.
Great, thank you. Maybe you could pass the mic to Marit.
Thank you very much to all our panelists. I think it's just been an amazing journey. And as Melissa said, there's so many common threads running through. John referred to ideological power, and I think with every single presentation, there is a dimension of ideological contestation. And I'd love to hear from whoever from among the panel would like to share with us a little bit about what kind of ideological contestations do they see in relation to the theme topic that they have shared with us. And the second question, very much related, if we ever have time, is how can recasting development take into account ideological contestation for us here as an IDS community? Thank you.
Wonderful. Let's go just behind you then.
Thank you. I'm Paul Segal. I'm at the Department of International Development at King's College London. So this is a fascinating set of research programs you have here. It's really, really interesting stuff. But I was very struck in a talk talking about recasting development. I don't think any of you mentioned China at any point. And it seems to me that this is kind of the elephant in the room that is changing every dimension that you mentioned. So of course, on the one hand, it's a very different kind of development model. Secondly, in terms of geopolitics, it's completely restructuring power structures around the world, including, you know, the response of the US to the threat to its hegemony. And then in terms of your specific topics, in terms of economies, there's massive investments in infrastructure. The massive demand for commodities from China is leading to restructuring of economies. It has a huge impact on finance. It's financing vast quantities of lending around the world. It's in terms of the politics, of course, it has a different vision from the sort of liberal democracy that most of us here grew up thinking of as the hegemonic approach. So it'd be great to hear what you think of how you think any of that stuff is affecting your particular areas. Thank you.
Okay, fantastic. So maybe we could look to our online audience if there, Steve, if you'd relay a couple of questions from that group.
Yeah, we've got one question online from Jonathan, and it's specifically aimed at Philip. So he asks if you could elaborate on a point you mentioned very briefly, which was the Western response to the war in Ukraine and how this set the stage for the current situation in Israel and Gaza.
Okay. And perhaps one more from online?
That's it for now.
That's
Hopefully
it for
we'll
now.
see some more
Right.
coming through.
Online audience, get your questions into the chat. One more from the room in this round. Okay, there we go, just towards the back there.
Hi, I'm Marcela Gomez. Thank you so much for everything you said. It was amazing. I was just wondering if we could talk a little bit more about what humanitarianism looks like when we are guided by a principle of justice, just to talk about the material way it looks like. Thank you.
Okay, wonderful. Right, well, I'll go back to the panel, perhaps in the audio presented in, and just pick up whichever of those questions you would like to. We've got a good group there. So, Maria, okay.
Thanks everyone for staying tuned in all these questions. So how to relate to civil society in Africa? I think it's not going to be a very easy time, but we also know that many societies just keep organizing regardless of external support. But I'd hope there'd be external support, but on their terms. I think this whole the debate on decolonizing development and listening to whose justice and whose voices, to pick up on John's phrases. I think those are very intimately related to questions of democracy and participation. So, of course, I'm very keen on youth civil society and different kinds of participation. How do we listen better? And how do we support those emerging voices in different ways? Picking up on the question of China and how it's different, and it has changed a world order. There's a multipolar order now, and not one hegemony in relation to how governments should rule themselves. China is not like any other autocrat, you know, it's that they're often lumped together with Russia in terms of how authoritarian it is, but it's behaving very differently. And I think in relation to, for example, the coups in West Africa, it's been surprisingly quiet, and it has an interest in economic stability in this region. So it kind of lets things go on and not inserting itself too much and imposing a political order. But has given countries in the Global South the option of choosing support from an actor that doesn't ask very critical questions. And that's how it's really changed democracy. Shall I pass on?
Yes, please do. So, Jodie.
Great. Well, I'll pick up on a couple of the questions. So perhaps first in relation to civil society in Africa. I mean, I think there's an incredible examples in different places around the question of food sovereignty and mobilization of civil society around food justice, but also food sovereignty. And I see in Africa as well a growing interest, not only in civil society, but including civil society in questions about who is food being grown for, to what ends, who is benefiting from that economic process of food production. And I think, you know, that, and I can think of some examples not related to food, but related to sort of how civil society in Ghana mobilized to try to influence government decision-making or government and IMF decision-making related to some of the debt issues that we heard about earlier. And I think in a similar way to engage with some of the government's increasing policies in different countries around questions of food. Developing a sort of a deliberative process around food sovereignty, perhaps similar to what I mentioned from Toronto. Just briefly on the ideological contestation, I'm not sure if this is the type of issue that you were thinking of, but for me, implicitly, what the examples and the discussions I've engaged with around economic democratization is the question of what is the purpose of the economy? And I think that is a big ideological question. And there's no doubt that the industrialized food system is really good at producing a lot of food, but we don't only want food for calories. There's all sorts of other purposes to the food economy. And so that, but then there are ideological trade-offs of whose values count. And it goes to some of John's points, I think.
Yeah, that's a great example. So, Philip, there were several points there directed at you specifically.
So I'll answer three of them. Ideological contestation. I believe I'm making a plea for humanitarians to engage in ideological contestation because ideological contestation is going on around them all of the time. And unfortunately, they're not very punchy in responding back. And there is a basis for a humanitarian ideology. It's called international humanitarian law. However, it is very rarely upheld, at least for everyone, which brings us to the question of Ukraine. Now, I think now that the genocide in Gaza has reached such a severity, it would have always caused such a massive reaction that it has. However, that attack happening at the same time as we see what looks to me like a pretty perfect response to a humanitarian emergency in Ukraine, opening borders, vast amounts of fund, posters going up in Heathrow saying, have you seen a war crime in Ukraine? You can report it. I mean, my God, imagine that. You would never see that for Palestinians because they can't leave, right? So that's the level of hypocrisy that's undermining humanitarian values is enhanced with such severity because of its coincidence with a very good response in Ukraine, which is the kind of response we should be building everywhere, regardless as to who those people are. The question of what would a just humanitarian look like, this is what some of my previous research has explored through the lens of what I call activist humanitarianism. Now, it's not scalable necessarily, but in response to perceived failures around various crises, you often find that there are humanitarian first responders who have political affiliations. So again, in Ukraine, you see that a lot of people who were responding to the emergency were themselves politically aligned. We also saw it, for instance, on the European refugee crisis in the Mediterranean, so-called crisis, where a lot of the first responders came from left-wing socialist organizations sailing boats out into the Mediterranean until the only other organization that started assisting in that crisis, which was MSF. And I think MSF, in terms of mainstream organizations, does give us the clearest indication of what a more just humanitarianism might look like. So MSF is a lot more flexible in its applications of the principles, and a lot of its internal policy documents and debates discuss the contradiction between the value of humanity and neutrality. So in many cases, MSF has felt the need to speak out against war crimes because you cannot be neutral in the face of a genocide. This much should be obvious. But MSF gives us a kind of model. Now, beyond that, to the scalability, that's where I think that there's space for a research agenda that looks and thinks through what would it look like to empower humanitarian justice on a multilateral level? For example, removing the United States of America from the Security Council and replacing it with a humanitarian agency might be a start. Putting humanitarian agencies in the Security Council, that might be a start. Politicians actually listening to what humanitarians are saying rather than pretending that they care for humanitarian aid. So these are some ways in which we can think about it, but that's what I would like to explore as my recasting development position is how could we insert justice and what would it do? Thank you.
Thank you very much for that. I'm just going to address two particular points. The first one is on Africa civil society, CSOs, and their participation in recasting development. I previously alluded to the Zimbabwean Coalition on Debt and Development. They're supported by AfroDead. They've made significant contributions, not just in terms of court cases and supporting calls for transparency in debt, but they've also pushed for advocacy and they've also pushed for debt cancellation, particularly given the crazy interest rates following default. So there've been a number of areas. It's not just through the legal avenues or just advocacy, but just sensitizing the world. Also on that, so I primarily work in the international tax development space, tax and trade. So that's how tax rules are developed. And there's been a tectonic shift in power from OECD countries which developed tax rules since the League of Nations, when they exported capital and expected returns. That's how the tax system is structured. It's focused on capital exporting states, to advocating for rights for developing countries in terms of being able to tax in their own way, in their own structured way. And so example, the Tax Justice Network Africa Group, what I've found over the years is there's been increased presence of these organizations in the UN meetings that we attend, in the specific rooms which inform some of these institutions. Also in the African context, example, the Tax Justice Network Africa Group just signed an MOU with the African Union yesterday, literally yesterday, or at least they publicized it yesterday, might have been last week, but it shows the strength of some of these groups in developing technical positions sometimes in research and pushing and mainstreaming after lobbying support. So, and also just a fun fact, I just thought I'd highly mention the co-plaintiff in that case regarding the Zimbabwean Coalition for Debt and Development. She's in her late 20s, has an LLB. She's not a high technical researcher, but she's passionate about what she did, and they were successful in that case. So if some of you here in this room are wondering what you do, whether you get into technical areas, there's an interesting space for development and advocacy and being able to change the world with your technical skills, right? Sorry, and just on China, I'm going to try to keep this one short, but this is probably the longest point. I should have spent more time on this, but we can talk after this when we're done, by the way. IMF, World Bank has not been able to address critical infrastructure gaps in Africa. China saw an opportunity. The previous place where I used to work in Amsterdam, I had a professor who came to me and said, Mbaki, so the thing about Europe is when we provide funds in terms of the infrastructural system, the systematic, what they have, they will expect tax reforms. They will expect expenditure-related adjustment. China will not tell you what to do with your domestic policy. And unfortunately, because we have not followed due process in terms of our management systems, and we've had corrupt leaders, we take the money and that results in severe debt. Well, that's other things. But interesting enough, when you talked about this debt restructuring in Zambia, the amount which was being restructured, when I talked about an organization or debtors, creditors, who opposed the deal under the G20 common framework, China opposed it because they thought they weren't getting a good deal from it. So it's a very nuanced area, but Africa needed the money. Europe comes with, sorry for saying Europe, to be honest, it's a number of institutions, primarily OECD states, right? But I think the main point is they don't want to get involved in our politics, they want returns. But because of that, research which is emerging is showing how they have very onerous and unfair terms regarding securities and taking control of certain infrastructural developments in critical infrastructure, which they spent on airports, roads, which they would toll for a period of time. But yeah, so you take revenue with a pinch of salt, but how to recast development is through transparency. A lot of the agreements are not transparent. IMF, World Bank, multilateral development banks, the agreements are transparent. China wants its returns, but will not disclose what it's doing to ensure that they secure their debt. Because at the end of the day, they're private agreements.
Right. John.
Great questions, just to pick up on a couple of them. The question of civil society, I think most people have addressed. Civil society is critical for every single issue that we've talked about here. It oftentimes has been driving change and will need to continue to drive change. But we need to be clear that we're talking about a difference between the civil society, the organized civil society sector, and civil society as a host of non-state citizen community-based labor actors. The sector itself has been under a great deal of criticism in recent years for not driving enough change rapidly enough. It's lost a lot of its funding. And I was thinking the other day, we used to have great debates in this room about the role of civil society in development, and somehow that we're not talking about it the same way. But what we are talking about is the role of different forms of citizen participation and informal engagement, like Marioka talked about, as the driving force of change. And that is also civic action rather than organized civil society. And that, I think, is where the future lies. Now, if you take the particular example that I looked at, we have a problem because most of the conversation about what constitutes a just transition isn't involving the communities who are at the front lines of energy production and extraction, like the communities in the Niger Delta in Nigeria. So Rosie McGee and several of us in this room are involved in some very interesting research now, looking at how would you bring the voices of the frontline energy communities to the debates of what a just transition looks like. And that's a huge challenge, but one that I think is a new frontier for development. But to do that means taking on Marissa's point about dealing with ideology. Ideology is a form of hegemony that promulgates certain kinds of values. And the value that we must exploit nature in order to develop in a certain way has been predominant for the last 150 years. And the oil companies and the coal companies have spent millions, and increasingly, as the most recent figures show, that as the decline is coming, they are upping their money for promoting a certain ideology under the name of PR about why fossil fuel extraction is absolutely necessary for the world. To counter that means a different narrative. And how do we construct that narrative from below that really brings in the voices of the people most affected? And again, Rosie and others are doing some research on that. In power terms, we think about this not as dealing with the power over that companies have had or the power to act, but the new need for the power for. That is the ability to imagine a different world and articulate it with a new kind of ideology or discourse. And in a world, in Gramsci's term, in the interregnum period, when one regime is declining, another is emerging, it's the ability to articulate that counter set of norms, which will give you real power. And that's what civil society needs to learn to do as well.
Fantastic. So great answers to great questions. We've probably got time for one more round, quite short, if people could keep their questions quite brief. I'll go first to the back here, to Lila, and then we'll come over to this side and then back to the centre. And then Steve, maybe there's time for one more from the room.
Hi, wonderful panel. Thank you. Just two quick questions. So first, in terms of, I think two around aid governance and global governance. So around aid, if we're looking at recasting development, given that we've heard about the sheer hypocrisy and also the fact that populism is there, so that affects the way donors behave. So what would our message be for in 2024 to the donors about addressing these things, given what we've heard? And secondly, I think what we've seen also in the recent weeks with, you know, the multipolar world changing, global governance, and, you know, this amazing ICG judgment, and really the global South pushing back, but the reaction that we then get in terms of UNRWA. So what would the lesson be in terms of how do we flip this idea of global governance? You know, you've spoken about the Security Council getting the US out, but I mean, what else can we say in terms of where we want to go as IDS in terms of research?
Okay. Thank you. So I think there was a question over to the far side here.
Thank you. My name is Vitalis. I'm a student in MA Gov. I would like to look at recasting development to focus on a particular issue. Within the last 3 years, there have been 5 military coup d'etat in Africa, and 3 of them have been in the Sahel region, that is Niger, Mali, and Burkina Faso. How do we re-engage these military leaders to discuss about issue of climate change, taking into consideration that these areas are semi-arid regions? How do we engage them in development?
Okay, really good question there. James, I'll come to you.
Yeah, I had a question about sort of unruly politics and informal or non-traditional political action. I mean, we hear these very positive remarks about how valuable and important the rise of unruly politics is, community action, direct action, which rejects traditional political engagement. But then in parallel, we also keep talking about populism. And there are an awful lot of young people and others who are also taking part for the first time in demonstrations, in public exhibitions of their distrust and what they feel as being excluded from mainstream politics. I guess I'm really asking kind of where are the connections between those two versions of not informal, non-traditional political engagement?
Good question. And then Steve, do we have any online, maybe 1 or 2 quick ones?
We've got lots of questions now, so
just choose 2.
Anne from Switzerland has got a general question for everybody. She said, I see lots of questions in these presentations, but few ideas of how to address the various injustices. How can we even start to address economic injustice and promote just transformation when there are so many pitfalls associated with every answer? If I've got a second question. Yep. So Hilary asks a question linking Jodie's focus on participatory power over the purpose and content of what is produced, and John's focus on the power relations of a just transition. What about the role of the trade unions as civic economic agents of propositional change? As organisations of labour, they surely give a potentially unique importance as source of economic power and knowledge to influence the nature of transition to low carbon technologies. Any ideas on how this potential could be realised?
Okay. Good. And then there's one more question at the front here.
Thank you. Thank you, everyone. I am Abdul, recent graduate of MEDEF from Gaza. A question to Philippe about humanitarian justice, which is a great thought. Given that the humanitarian organizations have no army, have no power to protect themselves, and given how states are not respecting international humanitarian law after the ICG, for example. And you have said, for example, how we have local, national humanitarian organizations stick to the ground, do their work, like the Palestine Red Crescent, and now, right at the right moment, Israel is besieging and occupying its last headquarters in Gaza and Khan Yunis after they demolished its hospital in Gaza City. So can we see, or is it beneficial for humanitarian aid, for humanitarianism, if states take action on the ground to enforce humanitarian aid, humanitarian justice, or will it make it worse? And in this world governed by the US and its allies, can we see a role for states to take action on the ground to enforce humanitarian justice?
Great. So I'm going to now go back to the panel and ask you to be, there's another great set of questions, but to be very brief, and if you can be forward-looking in the spirit of, as it were, propositional politics, a couple of things that you would say for the future in as practical a way as possible. What does it mean to recast development?
Thanks very much. I think whose justice and pursuing justice as a way of looking at development. When we ask, so which donors are we going to tell to work to support democracy if populism is sweeping Europe? So where are the Democratic Alliance? Where will they be? When Trump pulled out from reproductive health services and UNFPA, other donors stepped up. So where are the donors now that will step up for democracy and create an alliance? It's not just governments, there's other actors that can do this. And in Europe specifically, if speaking about populism, the younger generation has climate change as on the top of their list of agenda for the future. And it's the older generation that talked about migration. So and as that a potential security risk for Europe. So there are generational differences. And so I wouldn't just speak to the donors and call for action. It's the people that vote these governments in. And there will be, if we tell the story right, eventually, we're hopefully, with an optimistic story, we'll swing back and have less of the populist influence on the European donors.
Excellent questions, difficult questions. I'm going to try with James's question. I'm not sure if I fully will respond to it, but at least I'll respond to the request to be propositional. I think perhaps it's looking at the different forms of participation or political action, political participation. So there are informal actions that are grassroots, bottom up, trying to come up with alternatives. But I mentioned the example from Brazil, which I thought was really interesting, where they were also engaging in formal political processes through this Colombo Periférico, which was looking at a different way because it was a collective representation within the city government. It was a different way to engage with formal politics. So I think looking at these alternatives that cut across different forms of participative, deliberative, representational democracy is a fruitful area. On the trade unions, I think in a way I've got a similar answer, which is what is the potential for trade unions to engage in deliberative processes, engage in issues that affect their members beyond the firm or the company or the sector that they're directly involved with. And I have no doubt that there are probably trade unions that are already doing that, but that would be my thought in response to that question.
Thank you.
Thanks. So yeah, I'm going to again pick a selection that I think I can answer. So aid and global populism. If we take the situation with the pausing of funding of UNRWA, it doesn't actually make sense within a populist framework, because if we look at survey data, the vast majority of people in most global North countries support a ceasefire. So I don't know what the populism that decision is actually responding to. And also, I do not think this, and do not let this be clipped as something I think, but from the perspective of global North donors, one of the justifications historically for maintaining organizations like UNRWA and an aid response is to prevent refugee flows into Europe. Again, this goes against the traditional rationale of why you would fund an organization like UNRWA. It really seems to go against that. The other issue that populism affects aid is that it's very difficult to convince people that you should just give people money. Right. So this is one of the traditional problems with trying to move into, in these crises contexts, advocacy for categorical forms of social protection or universal forms of social protection, as people say, well, they have to do something. Maybe they have to go and do a labor market skills training that we'll never use. You know, they do it to us in the welfare state here, right? You have to do something in order to get the money. So that populist sort of reaction is damaging to aid flows. Maybe surprisingly, I also want to talk about trade unions, because when I was thinking about what does a just humanitarian system look like, recently I've done a high-level evaluation for the ILO and where they are working in post-conflict recovery contexts. So those kinds of protracted crises I was talking about. And it was a very strange experience because I kept being told, well, you need to refer to the normative mandate. You need to refer to labor law. So every time I was making a point, I had a kind of legal reference point to justify it through international labor law. Again, it's not very well enforced, but it was a very different experience working with a development organization in a crisis recovery context. And through that, the ILO has a quite good system for working politically in these contexts called the tripartite approach. I don't know how many people are aware of it, but the ILO's core partners are trade unions, business chamber representation, and governments, and they all agree on projects. And it seems to be quite an effective way of working because it tackles who drives change, who makes sure change happens, labor unions, who permits it, employers, who legislates, government. It seemed to be an effective way to move out of crises. So the final point that I wanted to talk about is the issue of the humanitarian armies. Of course, that did exist for a while, the responsibility to protect, where there were humanitarian interventions. Humanitarians don't have armies. I would want to first start quite small, which is that heads of agency should probably stop using the passive voice to describe the murder of their staff. That would be the beginning point. And then moving there, using that moral weight of argument to see if that begins to cause broader shifts, because that it isn't enough with the passive voice. Thank you.
Thank you. So just quickly, maybe just one or two final forward-looking points.
Yes, on the issue of the coups in West Africa, I'm going to merge that with the point of recasting development in terms of how to move forward. And I'll take it from an international law position. There have been a number of principles which have been in international text under special and differential treatment, and there's also common but differential responsibilities that's under climate. And all it basically means is one size does not fit all. And I'm just going to stop there. We need to be able to implement and activate that and not just leave it in text, but just say when you deal with a country and you're dealing with transitions, you cannot expect all the states to have the same capabilities. You have to differentiate and allow others to transition longer and others shorter. And we need to mean what we say and say what we mean. That is not what happens currently in different tax dispensations. It might happen sometimes in certain climate dispensations, but doesn't happen all the time. So that cuts across disciplines. Countries are not the same. And lastly, on ICJ, because no one addressed that ICJ particular point in terms of at least pushback, what South Africa is anticipating, by the way, but this is from an international law perspective and not necessarily about humanitarianism, is that there might be pushback from some of its key partners due to the fact that they had taken the case on. So my main question and how we need to think about recasting development is, who are we punishing? Are we punishing a state or the individuals on the ground who need the funds?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thanks. Very quickly. I don't want to lose the point from the Sahel, which is about the relationship between the military rise and coup and climate change, as I understood it. Don't want to say much about that, except let's treat that as canary in the mines. That as climate scarcity and resource scarcity increases, I think we can also see with it rising forms of military and authoritarian power to protect vested interests. And I think that's going to be happening everywhere, as my remarks said. Finally, to speak to donors, and the key message for recasting development in 2024 is not to let populism move us away from the popular. The growth of populism means that many donors and others are giving up on civil society, giving up on bottom-up approaches, giving up on the role of citizens in bringing about change. But I would argue that the reason populism has emerged is because the left, progressive groups, development thinkers, others have failed to give a meaningful explanation for people whose lives have been threatened by vast economic change and social insecurity. And until we can fill that ideological gap, that narrative gap, populism will continue. And how will that gap be filled? It will be through developing those small experiments, such as Jody talked about. It'll be about giving civil society more opportunities to reflect and build its own narrative based on its own experience from the bottom up. We will not refill it from a top-down narrative. Then we have simply competing forms of authority trying to tell people what to think rather than listening to what people need. So reclaim populism.
John, thank you so much. Well, I think you will all agree that this has been an extraordinary set of presentations and discussions. I'm going to say three very, very quick things. Firstly, when we've decided to call this event Recasting Development, and then the broader work we're doing and thinking with our partners, recasting has two senses. It's partly about reshaping, revisiting, changing, challenging the past. But it's also, and I owe this to Peter Taylor, a bit like a fisher person casts a line forward into the future. It is about reimagining things differently. And I think we've heard a great deal this evening about those forward-looking reimaginations. The second point is that really comes across, I think, is that the problems are intersecting. And that is partly because they're shaped by power relations that are also intersecting. That mixture of material power, ideological power, overt power often exercised through violence, but also hidden power that are actually responsible for the problems of extractivism, of corporate control of food systems, of violence and the problems we see in the humanitarian world, of climate change, and so on. But equally, so are some of the solutions, and this is my third point, deeply intersecting. And I think if there's been a common theme, and perhaps it's a very IDS theme, it does relate to a lot of what we do, it's that looking ahead is going to be best driven by those narratives from below. Articulated well, pushed by groups, often from the margins, and in informal ways as well as formal ways, different kinds of politics, pushing for different forms of justice, which has again been the big theme this evening. If we're going to recast development, who is going to recast it? It's going to be all sorts of different citizens and people and groups in different places around their issues. But the question and the forward-looking point is, can they add up to really big change in those multiple pathways coming together? And I think that will also depend on whether they can be met with the accountability and the forms of global action that we've also been talking about in the development space. So thank you enormously to all of our 5 speakers, to everybody in the room and online who've posed fantastic questions and provocations, much more than we've had time to address. But please spread the word. This event has been recorded, and let's continue the conversation through 2024 in this really important year of recasting. Thank you.